Well, hello, good evening, and welcome to episode 58 of Humanity versus Insanity, the Crane Report. Well, it's been 2 weeks since the last episode, and my goodness, the insanity is certainly ramping up. But before we get into that this evening, I was hoping to host an event in London before the year end, but sadly it looks as though that's not going to be feasible. But there will be an event in Amsterdam. So if you fancy a long weekend in Amsterdam, the weekend before Christmas, then do come along to this Overmind event, the Overmind Conference, which is being hosted by Willem Velderhof on the Saturday 19th of December. And it's just a short distance south of Schiphol Airport, so easy to get to. And if you go on to Facebook and search for Overmind Conference, you'll find the Facebook page there. Now, my presentation at this event is going to be titled Global Lockdown, the Total Control Agenda. And I'll be covering a lot of the issues that we've been addressing through this whole series of Humanity versus Insanity, but getting into some serious depth, but also looking, of course, at solutions. And the other speakers at this event will be Ollie Damagard, who will be commenting on, or giving us an analysis of his interpretation of what occurred in Paris recently. Ollie has done some excellent research onto false flag events, not just over the last decade or so, but going back through history. And Desiree Rover, who has done some outstanding work in looking at the vaccine agenda. Sadly, she lost a daughter to vaccines some years ago, and she will be exploring the chemical warfare that is being perpetrated on humanity by Big Pharma. And Willem Velderhof. Willem is a former pilot with a major airline, and William will be discussing the subject of geoengineering and how geoengineering is having a seriously negative impact, not just on humanity, but on the planet in general. And of course, geoengineering is a subject that, whilst acknowledged along with weather modification by the establishment, but is denied by the broader masses, despite the clear evidence that is in the public domain. But of course, like all things, you do have to look for it. I'll just leave this up on the screen so those of you who are watching this on YouTube can pause at this point just to see the synopsis of my presentation that I'll be presenting in Aalsmeer on Saturday the 19th. And of course, it's a great opportunity to hook up with like-minded people from right across Europe, because Amsterdam is a great hub, and there will be people from Denmark, or from Scandinavia, from Germany, from Belgium, and it'll be a great opportunity to compare notes on everything that's unfolding. Now, the last 2 episodes of Humanity versus Insanity straddled the Paris event. So on the 9th of November, just 4 days before the Paris event, that's the only thing way I'm going to describe it right now, we had Max Egan, and we were discussing the agenda, the broader agenda, of course, focusing very much on the Middle East and how ISIS are being effectively used to create Greater Israel. And the explanation, of course, as to why it is that ISIS don't attack Israel, because Israel, along with the US and the UK, are their prime supporters. And then on the 16th, 2 weeks ago, I was with Patrick Henningsen, and of course we were looking just 3 days after the Parisian event, but we were discussing the holes that were appearing. And of course, the biggest hole in this event is the fact that there was an exercise going on that morning. And this, of course, is the first clue that the event is being perpetrated by those who seek to gain from it. And there's no question that everyone who is watching this program will be well aware that there would be no other reason for it. Of course, all of the alleged perpetrators were effectively EU residents, despite the fact that, of course, the magic passport, this time being a Syrian passport, was supposedly discovered at the location. Meanwhile, of course, everyone, it would seem, is taking the opportunity to ramp up their control agenda. And of course, David Cameron is desperate for the third year running to get a mandate to launch an attack on Syria. Of course, it was in August of 2013 that he wanted to bomb Assad because Assad had allegedly unleashed chemical weapons on the civilian population of Syria. Fortunately, sanity prevailed because Cameron's claim was, of course, evidence-free, and it actually would seem, based on the evidence that is available, is that although there was a tragic release of chemical weapons, it wasn't perpetrated by Assad. It was perpetrated by those who were trying to oust Assad. And the chemical weapons, it seems, had been provided by Saudi Arabia. But unfortunately, Saudi Arabia had not sent along the handling instructions. So that was Cameron's attempt to get the support of Parliament 2 years ago. So fortunately, sanity prevailed. He didn't get that mandate. But of course, he hasn't given up. He's pretty much been trying ever since. And how quickly we forget. I was speaking to somebody just a few days ago, and they actually thought that the Tunisian event was well over a year ago. Well, it was actually just exactly 5 months ago. And of course, this was when Cameron was threatening RAF bombing raids against Islamic State in Syria. PM says the response would be in wake of the Tunisian beach massacre and must involve military solutions. Well, I think that there's a distinct likelihood that he has been launching surreptitious bombing sorties on Syria. But of course, he wants to do it more openly, and so consequently, he is using the recent Paris event, despite the fact that I think there was one Briton supposedly killed in that event. But he's looking to jump on the back and launch another attack. And of course, who's going to benefit? Well, the arms industry, and of course, indirectly, the Conservative Party from the donations that they will get from their arms industry sponsors. And whilst I may not necessarily agree with everything that Peter Hitchens writes in the Daily Mail, this is one time that I will certainly go along with him. And his statement was, this isn't just a war, it's recreational bombing by a Churchill wannabe. So the picture there is, of course, David Cameron indulging in a little bit of foreplay, whilst he endeavours to convince the nation in dulcet, measured tones that Britain needs to launch an attack on the civilian population. Of course, he claims it will be ISIS, but we all know that it will result in civilian casualties. And how anyone can actually believe that by attacking Syria, it's going to make the country safer, then, well, all I can suggest is that they are either delusional or actually insane. So for anybody, and I doubt there's too many people watching this who do support the proposal to launch an attack on Syria, but I just want to share with you the likely result. Are you really willing to be a part of this? An insanity? I find it very, very difficult to comprehend a species that seems to take delight in annihilating other members of the same species. Or maybe they're not members of the same species, or maybe they perceive themselves to be members of a different species. I mean, let's bear in mind that it's only barely 50 years ago that the Aborigines in Australia were actually given recognition as part of humanity. Up until the early 1960s, they were actually regarded as part of flora and fauna. And in Western Australia, up until the early 1960s, it was still considered okay to go out hunting the Aborigine population. So it's not quite so absurd to believe that although they may deny that they have this superiority complex, the way in which they behave and the way in which they treat life with such disdain, one could be forgiven for thinking that that is indeed the case. Well, just let's take a look at this symbolism. And I have discussed this on previous episodes of Humanity versus Insanity, and in many presentations, some of which you can certainly find on my YouTube channel. This is a piece of artwork which appeared in 3 languages, or has appeared in 3 languages in recent years. It appeared in French, in Dutch, and in English. Obviously in French it was in France, in Dutch it was in Holland, and in English it was in Ireland. And in each case, this artwork appeared in the run-up to the referenda that was held in those countries regarding the continued membership of the European Union. And although both France and the Netherlands registered no votes, their leadership basically said, well, thanks very much for letting us know what you think, but we're staying in anyway. Of course, in Ireland, thanks to an amazing Irishman who unfortunately is not known to too many people in Ireland today, Raymond Crotty, the Irish actually had in their constitution the requirement for a referendum in the event of the government seeking to hand over any part of national sovereignty to a foreign entity. And of course, when the Irish didn't get it right first time, or even the second, so they had to keep voting until they got the result they were looking for. And it is certainly my opinion, based on feedback that I've had from people in the Irish Republic, that the likelihood of the Irish people actually voting yes was about the same as the Scots voting no in the recent referendum there. So a bit of manipulation possibly, because otherwise it was going to start to get a bit too suspicious. But in this artwork, what we have here is the Tower of Babel. And of course we know it's the Tower of Babel because of Bruegel's artwork, indelibly printed on our consciousness. Here we have what most people perceive to be the stars representing the flag of the EU. In reality, it's not the case at all, because what this is, it is the geometry of Baphomet. And it is the same geometry as used on the Uncle Sam posters from the First World War. Your country needs you. And this is the geometry that was used for Uncle Sam. This was the beard, the hat was covering the top part of the pentagram here. Baphomet, clearly showing who those who drafted this artwork believe to be their god, with a small g. The tower represents the inner sanctum of those who believe themselves to be the rightful rulers of a planetary fiefdom. Wrongly, in my opinion, but in their opinion, they are the rightful rulers. The moat represents the same as the separation between the capstone and the rest of the pyramid. The knowledge and the wisdom being retained inside the inner sanctum, the moat separating that knowledge and the wisdom from the masses. The two figures here in the grey suits looking longingly across the moat, thinking, what have we got to do? What have we got to do to get inside, to be embraced as part of the inner sanctum? Well, the reality is they will never get in there. It doesn't matter how much they prostitute themselves, they will never be invited into the inner sanctum. And here we have the masses. And the masses are represented in this artwork as wooden tops, as square heads, with the exception of one, the baby, right here. And what this illustrates is the desire to ensure that by the time any newborn reaches young adulthood, they have been so dumbed down that they are effectively wooden tops, and that they are effectively either cannon or factory fodder, ready to serve those who believe themselves to be the rightful rulers. And here we see, this is the Strasbourg Parliamentary Building, and here you can see clearly it is based on the artwork produced by Bruegel some few hundred years earlier. So who is calling the shots here? Because there is no question, if you go back and you hold any kind of poll amongst the proletariat, amongst the masses, you are not going to find too many people who believe it to be appropriate to launch unmitigated, unwarranted attacks on fellow humanity. In fact, all the polls I've seen run this weekend, one run by the Daily Mirror, one run by the Huffington Post, in both cases, the percentage voting against the attack on Syria, recommending that Cameron does not pursue that agenda, was in excess of 80%. And that's what I would have expected to see. In fact, it's disappointing that it's not even higher, but you're always going to have about 20% of the population that unfortunately are so dumbed down that they will simply do whatever it is that their alleged leaders propose for them to do. So who is this? Well, obviously, as is always the case, I encourage you to do your own research. But one book that I would absolutely recommend is this book, The Story of the Committee of 300, The Conspirators' Hierarchy. Now, Dr. John Coleman published this book first time round in 1986. So when it was published back then, that's what, just under 30 years ago, before the days of the internet. So the book was based on hardcore research, an outstanding insight. Now, I must confess, I first read this, I think around about 2000 or 2001. And there were certain aspects of it that I didn't necessarily buy into, but nonetheless, it was an exceptional insight. Well, he republished it in 2006, so 20 or so years later, but of course with the benefit of about a decade or so of the internet. So there were multiple upgrades and modifications to the book, and now I certainly recommend this. It is an outstanding piece of work. So who are the 300? Well, of course, the 300 actually is believed by many to refer to the Watchers, i.e. those who were deposited on Mount Hermon on the basis that they had breached their code and that they had fornicated. This is the Elohim, as referenced in Genesis chapter 6, verse 4. The Elohim, which is plural, means gods and goddesses. But those who had perpetrated the crime of sex between species, sex with human women. And for that crime, they were sentenced to remain here on earth, locked into this physical reality. Well, whether or not it is the case, there is no question that, in my mind anyway, that those who believe themselves to be the rightful rulers do certainly believe for themselves that there is some truth in this, and that they are either part of the 300 or direct descendants of the 300. And of course, the descendants of the 300 and the human women were known as the Nephilim. Now, there have been many attempts to create a structure of the control mechanism. And there's a number of these diagrams on the web. And the reality is that they're all very good stabs. The reality is that these organizations, these corporations, these NGOs that are identified are all part of the mechanism to give the impression that people have the opportunity to participate in the global agenda. In reality, of course, it is a total charade, and these organizations are used to pursue that agenda. And of course, a big part of this is through the financial control. Because as we all know, one of the most effective means of keeping people in lockstep is through debt. Whether it's the private individual, whether it's the NGO, whether it's the nation state, get them in debt and you have them in your control. And of course, it's not going to come as any great surprise that effectively all of the countries that have been targeted as part of the axis of evil over the last couple of decades or so, 25 years, the common denominator is that they are or were all operating outside of the central banking system. They were not signed up to the Rothschilds fractional reserve banking system where the country could be enslaved through debt. And this is a massive part of why it is that the US, the UK and Israel all want to see Assad removed from Syria so that he can be replaced with a tame puppet who the first thing that they will do is set up a Rothschilds-controlled central bank and enslave the country through debt. Well, one of the phrases that we see being used is the elite network. But in reality, this isn't elite. We have to start changing the terminology, because the reality is that those who believe themselves to be the rightful rulers of a planetary fiefdom are in fact parasites. They are parasitic entities that need humanity, just in the way that a dog doesn't need its fleas, but the fleas need the dog. And the ruling elite are parasites. And this is how we should start referring to them. So anytime you hear anybody use the phrase ruling elite, correct them. It's ruling parasites. And they're prostitutes. Because the reality is that all of those whose names you know, all of the people in the public domain, whether it's Cameron, whether it's Obama, even whether it's Netanyahu, they are simply the prostitutes to the parasites. And the entire network, we see in this chart here, this entire network, the vast majority of people associated with these institutions or these organizations have effectively prostituted themselves to the parasites. Of course, in return, they get the nice lifestyle. They get taken care of. They have a check going into their bank on a regular basis. And all they have to do in return is sell their souls. Well, this piece of artwork, of course, this wonderful piece of street art that was posted in Brick Lane, I think now a little over 3 years ago. So the ruling parasites. Well, of course, this is the $64 million question. Who are they? Well, I think we can all agree that they exist, but who they are, well, that's the ongoing debate. And I don't profess to have the definitive answer, but the reality is that what I do know is that the prostitutes are working for them. They have sold their souls. And they are literally, as this artwork displays here, playing their games, in this case the game of Monopoly. They are playing their games on the backs of humanity. And humanity, in the vast majority of cases, can see that something isn't right, but they have not the first clue about how to break out of their enslavement. So let's start reviewing the terminology. We've already now established that we are no longer going to refer to those who are in the ultimate position of power as an elite. They are parasites. And those who are working for them as the prostitutes of the parasites. And then we have the masses. And, we hear people say, we are the 99%. Well, we're not. We're certainly not the 99%. The reality is that for whatever reason, 95, 96%, whatever, of people amongst the masses have little capacity to comprehend the breadth and depth of the agenda that is being perpetrated. Now, that's not a slight on them in any way, shape or form. There are those amongst that 95, 96% who have some awareness, but it's so uncomfortable for them that they just don't want to go there. And so it's easier to keep their head down and just to keep running ever faster on the treadmill, even though they know that something is not right. So that brings us then to the few percentage points that are in the middle somewhere, because if we accept that the ruling parasites and their prostitutes actually make up maybe 1% of the total population, then we have 96, 97% or so that unfortunately are just going to stay on the treadmill. So we have just 2 or 3, maybe 4% of people living on the planet right now who have the capability, the capacity, the curiosity, and the wherewithal to comprehend the magnitude of the deceit and the deception that is being perpetrated on humanity. So let's bring this about, because who are the elite? The elite are those who understand what is going on. The elite are those that are challenging the establishment, who do not have the power in terms of control of the financial system. They don't have the power in terms of military might. But what they do have is the power of investigative capability and creativity, collective creativity. The establishment has a strength in terms of a hierarchical structure, but it's also its Achilles heel, because it doesn't respond to creativity particularly well. The beauty of the increasing number of people who are joining the elite, who see through this agenda, is that they are bringing their own unique contribution and their unique element of creativity. So let's go back to this graphic here. So somewhere along the line, there's 3 or 4% of people that didn't succumb to the multi-pronged attack that is being perpetrated on humanity to prevent the young adults actually having any concept of sovereignty and simply becoming slaves to the system. And the multi-pronged attack is a major part of the parasitic agenda. And just consider how much effort is put into trying to fluoridate the water. How much effort was put into getting mercury into the mouths of young children, and particularly through the 1960s and 70s, where many dentists were incentivized to get as much mercury into the mouths of young children as they possibly could, into their baby teeth. And of course, now we're starting to see some of the science which would indicate that when fluoride comes into contact with the mercury, then it can have a devastating effect on the development of that individual's consciousness. So we've got fluoride, we've got the mercury in the teeth, then we've got the vaccines. And we've had discussions on the program before of this outrageous agenda to give in the US some 36 vaccines before a child reaches school age. And in many states in the US, the child can't even get into state school unless they can prove they've had this entire program of vaccinations. In the UK, it's about 2/3 of that, but there is the same pressure. In Australia, from the 1st of January, in just 1 month's time, no Australian will be able to get state benefits unless they have had their children vaccinated. And increasingly in Australia, although it should be amongst one of the wealthiest countries on the planet, there is increasing poverty, with more and more families dependent on state support in one way, shape or form. And here the state is saying from the 1st of January 2016, any parent that doesn't vaccinate their children will not be entitled to those benefits. This is the outrageous pressure that is being put on people to make sure that their children turn into blockheads by the time they get into young adulthood. Then, of course, we have the dumbed down education system. We have a situation in the UK where teachers are leaving the profession in droves. Many of the old school teachers can no longer tolerate the total lack of flexibility in the curriculum. They're forced to teach a very narrow band in their particular subjects, and finding it increasingly difficult to maintain control of children who are highly active, particularly as a result of their diet and their intake of sodas and the sugar content, which of course gives Big Pharma an opportunity to come in with the Ritalin. And this pervasive drug that is prescribed now reportedly to well over 100,000 children every year. And of course in the US, the common denominator in every one of the high school shootings is that the perpetrator was either on or had recently come off a course of SSRI, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors like Ritalin or Zoloft. So this multi-pronged attack, and we haven't even got on to the Wi-Fi, the smart meters, the mobile phones, and of course, we participate in this by not challenging it. And in fact, in many cases, we participate in it by prostituting ourselves to the agenda, and then we're convinced that we're doing the right thing for our community by signing in the fluoride into the water supply system, or out there pushing the vaccine agenda. My youngest son was recently confronted with the prospect of having the HPV vaccine. When this vaccine was introduced in the UK to all 13-year-old schoolgirls just 7 years ago, it was revealed that on the Ofsted committee, which took the decision to promote the HPV vaccine, the financial controller of GlaxoSmithKline was a member of that committee. Of course, once it was pointed out, then he held his hands up and said, oh yeah, okay, well, I guess I do have a conflict of interest, I'll stand down. But it was too late. What he had done in that decision, he could be retired, because he had contributed to GlaxoSmithKline's revenue more than any front of house salesman could have ever achieved. So, every single person watching this and any of the other alternative programs that are out in the ether, on the internet. And although YouTube is developing algorithms and Facebook are developing algorithms to try and restrict the spread of this type of information, and the nudge units are trying, like Demos, are trying to get people back into mainstream thinking. And of course, we're seeing the likes of David Cameron, and in France now, we've seen Hollande introduce legislation which enabled them to arrest climate change protesters before the weekend, obviously on the back of what had occurred recently in Paris. David Cameron has stated categorically that domestic extremists should be treated in the same way as ISIS. The 2, 3 or 4% of people that are able to see through the magnitude of the agenda being perpetrated by the parasites and their prostitutes need to step up to the plate. We perhaps only have 4 or 5 years maximum. If we haven't managed to bring about the changes that we all know we need to see by 2020, we are going to have a massive problem. But I do believe we can bring about those changes. But it does mean that people are going to have to step out of their comfort zones. It's no longer enough just to sit on the keyboard and post your thoughts on Facebook or on a blog or just click like. It's time to actually decide how you can make a contribution. And there's no panacea here. There's no right way to do it. Everybody is going to bring different skills, different abilities to this process. But the critical element is to take that step and get involved. Because if we don't, the reality is that we are going to be condemning future generations of humanity to lives of absolute abject misery. The evolutionary process is now in a negative mode, thanks to the parasites and their prostitutes who are effectively drugging our children. And of course, amongst the 95, 96%, they're going to be told that this is just rampant conspiracy. Whatever. Don't get dragged into those arguments. If that's what they want to believe, just ignore them, because they're not going to make a difference one way or the other. They're just going to sit on the sidelines. The opposition are very well organized. They have the money, they have the armaments, but what they lack is the creativity. And this is what we have to bring to bear. It's all around for everybody to see. And, well, how much more can we actually say? There are a lot of people who write great blogs. There's a lot of people who write great books. There's a lot of people who put out absolutely superb videos, superb documentaries. But every one of those people really now has to get involved. It doesn't matter what campaign you pick up, but pick up a campaign. If you have a profile, use that profile to help people step out of their comfort zone and challenge the ruling parasites and their prostitutes. At the same time, let's remember that the big difference between us and the parasites and their prostitutes is that we have the capacity for love and for compassion. And that's why anyone who believes that there is merit in launching outrageous attacks on any other human, they need to be pushed to one side. Ultimately, some justice will prevail. Hopefully, that justice will not be the same justice that they mete out themselves. Now, I'm going to change the tack. I'm going to play out with a track from a wonderful guy. This is Jody, who goes under the name of Trillion, based in New Zealand. He's given me permission to use some of his material in the past, not least on the Truth Injection, which I recorded in 2009. And congratulations to Jody, because he's also just become a father. So just to change the energy, I leave you with Trillion.
bird released in nature. You'll rise to like the sun. Being in love is like a piece of paper. Two sides, two lives, but one. And being in love is a line, it's an equator, where hemispheres both bond and part the whole. When one side falls, the other lifts, in a dance where balance responds at heart and soul. It's the perfect frequency, the frequency of love. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's the perfect frequency. It's the frequency of love. Yeah, yeah, yeah. When love is alive, it's an equation, but universal laws impede the sum. We find we get the same outcome consistently. All arithmetic leads to one. When we ride this wave of sound, the vibrations help us ground, and all of our disease and miseries become unbound. With the perfect frequency, it's the frequency of love. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's the perfect frequency, the frequency of love. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Two sides, two lives, but one. Two sides, but one. In the perfect frequency, the frequency of love. Yeah, yeah, the perfect frequency. It's the frequency of love. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Love, love, love.